Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay. Let's just be honest about what this is. This is a de facto registration system. To tell, I mean, if you say how much ammunition you need, how much you have, what type of firearm it is, it's a de facto registration system. Now, if we look at history, I like to think in terms of history being a warning from the future. And if we learn from history, we'd look at history and we'd say, gun registrations precede genocide by about 10 years. Now, is that the intent of the bill? I doubt it. But if you look at history, the people in this room don't really matter. None of us will be here in 10 years. If a law can be weaponized against you, it will be weaponized against you, and this law can and will be weaponized against the citizens of Colorado. As evidenced by the last bill that we just did, we spent 5 to 6 hours, listening to legislators who are willing to deprive of life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
Representative DeGraaf, could you get to the bill?
That's the problem with a registration system. So when we look at why we don't want to have a registration system, because I'm not a fan of genocide, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So one thing that we definitely forget, well, I try not to, that what we're doing in this room, we're not called to this room to govern. We're called to this room to represent the rights of the citizens. The citizens have rights. The government does not have rights. And that is a really, really big difference between our government and the feudal governments. Now, feudalism would be the type of government that where individuals don't own property, the abolition of private property, something else that this body is trying to create.
Representative DeGraaf, could we bring it to House Bill 1133?
Sure. So what we have is we have a system, and it is very specific, because if we just look at our Constitution, and this is a Constitution, if you ever have a chance to take a class from Mike Collar, I highly recommend it. The people have the right to own and carry firearms. We call this the Second Amendment. It may not be violated because a well-equipped militia is necessary for a state to remain secure and free. So then people say, well, we don't need a militia anymore because we have the National Guard. But we do have a militia, and the militia is very specific. The militia of the United States consists of all able-bodied males, at least 17 years of age, except provided in Section 313 of Title 32, under 45 years of age, who have made a declaration of intent to become citizens of the United States, and of female citizens of the United States who are members of the National Guard. The organized militia, which consists of the National Guard and the Naval Militia, the unorganized militia, which consists of the members of the militia who are not members of the National Guard or the Naval Reserve. So who is that? The members of the National Guard who are not members of the National Guard or Naval Militia, who are between the age of 17 and 45. So that's who we're talking about as for our militia. So age 17, they're expected to be in a militia. They are in a militia. It's not a matter of being expected to be in a militia. They are in a militia by law. And now when we look at this and it says, and may not be violated because a well-equipped militia is necessary for a state to remain secure and free. So let's look at let's go to what I call the fifth that. Because after that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. Powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and install a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. So if we have a government that no longer recognizes the right of the citizens to life, liberty, and property, and that their deprivation should not occur except with due process of the law, except for the previous 5 or 6 hours, that's why we have a Second Amendment. And that is why all of these issues are fought so vehemently. These are not just lightly penned words. These words were penned with great study of the Mediterranean, Middle East primarily, Roman, it should be Mediterranean, all of the great empires that preceded Europe. So these words were not written lightly in terms of being able to stand up to tyranny. So the Second Amendment, the purpose of the Second Amendment is to resist tyranny. Tyranny being the deprivation of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, and that would be by criminals either common or elected. And I think if you look at the history of our Second Amendment, the largest form of criminals that the founders were concerned with were those that are elected. So this is a de facto registration. You have to register, you have to show your ID, you have to give your identification papers. Let me see your papers. That's going to be recorded along with how much ammunition you bought, what type of ammunition you bought, when you bought that ammunition. All that goes to a database. All those data centers that we're all excited about having, that's where all this information goes. The surveillance state. So 17 to 45 is the militia, the unorganized militia or the organized militia. Now if we have, so if we are to remain free, as our founders taught, then we need a militia. That's what history taught. That's what history teaches. We need to have citizens that are armed in order to remain free. Now, it is not a safe world out there. In the Congo, 70 Christians were just found beheaded in their church.
Representative DeGraaf, can we bring it back to the bill?
The difference between the Congo and here would be Second Amendment. And these type of rules, as perhaps benign as they might sound, thinking, oh, it's just ammunition. It's just a registration for ammunition. It's just a registration for your firearms. How often do you shoot which firearm? There's no shortage of criminals in the world, and one thing that keeps them at bay is our Second Amendment. We keep the common criminals at bay with the Second Amendment, and we also keep the elected criminals at bay with the Second Amendment. And the elected criminals are the ones that you really need to worry about when you're dealing with the de facto gun registration. Because what does history show about gun registrations by tyrannical governments? Does a tyrannical government allow its citizens to remain armed? Certainly does not. So for all the people that think our current president, Donald J. Trump, is a impending tyrant, I think the defense of the Second Amendment would be opposite proof of that. So it's just ammunition. It's not just ammunition because the firearm is useless, and the ammunition is essential to the firearm to actually be a firearm. The ammunition would be the fire part of the firearm. So we don't live in a safe world, as evidenced by the 70 Christians that we've lost. But if you do not live in a safe world, if you have an issue with a lack of what we have is a lack of issue. We have a lack of respect for life, liberty, and property. Because all of these reasonable gun laws that keep piling up one on top of another, oh, it's just a reasonable gun law. It's just a reasonable gun law. It's just a reasonable gun law. And they don't work. That they don't work is not indication that we need another reasonable gun law. We're worried about mental health issues, as evidenced by the majority in this state, but we spend $500 million, $500 million, on mental health issues. Of course, we don't ask whether they're doing any good, we just spend more money. The infringements don't work, so you need to do something else, and the infringements are unconstitutional. So what we have to do is we have to think outside the box a little bit. The only time, whenever there's gun violence, whenever there's violence, utilizing the tool, which happens to be a gun, or it could be a pencil, it could be stones. All of those tools were used at one time. Cain and Abel, stone. So the infringements don't work. And the infringements are unconstitutional. So maybe we need to step back and go, okay, what is the real problem? Why do we have a culture that has no respect for life? Why do we have a culture that has no respect for property? Why do we have a culture that does not respect the liberty of others? I think the answer is pretty obvious.
Can we bring it back to the bill here?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This bill, again, is an infringement on the Second Amendment rights because the very nature of a firearm is the fire part of the firearm, and that is the ammunition. The continual infringements don't work. The registrations lead to genocide. So maybe we need to find a different mode of figuring out why do we have people that want to kill other people? Why do we have people that consider killing other people? Because I get that this is probably ultimately trying to get at crime rates. But really, we're talking about crime rates in the blue areas of Colorado.
Representative DeGraaf, please, to House Bill 1133.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. But we're talking about a gun registration, a de facto gun registration for all of Colorado, when the problem isn't all of Colorado. So Colorado has areas that are not able to police themselves, and so instead we turn it into a police state for everybody else. You need a different solution. Not a registration, not a gun registration. This is a gun registration. Is it a tax on ammunition? Yep, it's a tax on ammunition, but it is a gun registration. It's 100% what it is. It's just a different way to get to a gun registration, because if you say we want you to register your guns, then it becomes pretty obvious. But this is a gun registration that is wrapped in the guise of being about safety. The Second Amendment is there to preclude tyranny. The tyranny of the criminal, either common or elected. What you don't do then is you don't register your gun with an elected criminal. That's what this bill does. It requires you to register your firearm with the state, which is the most likely to violate your life, liberty, or property, as has just been proven. And the way, because ultimately this is also just against the law-abiding citizens of Colorado, as my colleague said earlier, from one of those counties that starts with L, like El Paso. Law-abiding citizens are prone to follow the law. Criminals are not inclined to follow the law. So what you have, once again, is you have a law that just makes being a law-abiding citizen that much more onerous. Will it do anything against criminals? Yeah, it will absolutely do stuff against criminals. It will make their lives that much easier. So if you want to make criminals' lives easier, if you want to increase crime, this is a great way to do it. Just like all of the other well-intentioned laws that increase crime. Nobody ever looks at that. What happens to all of your well-intended laws? You do all of these well-intended laws, and crime keeps increasing, but you don't stop and think, maybe it's those well-intended laws. We need to unwind the idea that this body of people that consider it their job to care more than others, Karens, that they can somehow dictate, and I mean dictate in the sense of dictator, they can dictate the lives of Coloradans to the point where they just behave. It doesn't work. Hasn't worked. Gun registrations, however, have worked. They are batting about 100%. Or batting 1,000, I guess. Batting 1,000. Gun registrations lead to genocide. This is a gun
Representative
registration.
DeGraaf, again, let's go back to House Bill 1133.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. House Bill 1133 is a gun registration. Historically, gun registrations lead to genocide, so that's the link. So it doesn't really matter what the intent is. I'm willing to give this as a good intent. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. That's where gun registrations will take us. That's where they've historically taken all human civilization. Weapons. An unarmed person is a slave or subject to becoming a slave at any given moment. So if you don't want to be a slave, don't vote for registering your gun, because registering a gun leads to the confiscation of a gun, and being at the after the confiscation of the gun, you're at the mercy of the government.